Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, NATO at 75, an Alliance for a Safer World. My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. 75 years ago today, 12 countries came together to sign the Washington Treaty, marking the very beginning of what would become the world's most powerful and successful military alliance. In 1949, NATO was founded to provide collective security and defense and prevent the outbreak of yet another world war. And in the 75 years that have followed, NATO has welcomed 20 additional allies, all committed to safeguarding democratic values and to promoting peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic region and beyond. And this anniversary is unquestionably a moment to take stock and celebrate the accomplishments of the most successful alliance in history. But these celebrations are taking place against a backdrop of tremendous uncertainty. War is raging in Europe, and the global security environment is increasingly volatile. So now more than ever, it's imperative for NATO allies to stand together to reaffirm their collective support for a secure, peaceful, and democratic global community. Today is not just a chance to reflect on the past, so it's also a moment to consider the next 75 years. Converging challenges from climate change to emerging technologies will fundamentally alter the battlefields of tomorrow. And the alliance must always be focused on the future and adaptive to the threats that lie over the horizon. So for that reason, convenings such as this one are integral to the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which seeks to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. And so as part of this mission, the Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative shapes and influences the debate on the great security challenges facing the alliance and its key partners. Today's event is part of the Atlantic Council's programming organized in advance of the 2024 NATO Summit here in Washington, so be on the lookout for much more to come from the Council in the coming months. So in this spirit, we have organized and convened two panels. The first brings together a group of Atlantic Council experts to highlight the alliance's historic underpinnings and to celebrate the alliance's enduring legacy. The second panel will look to feature the voices of next-generation experts and leaders to discuss how NATO can secure its future for the next 75 years. This first panel will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Matt Koenig, Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. And with that, Matt, I will pass it to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jenna. Welcome, everyone. And indeed, the anniversary provides a valuable opportunity both to look back at NATO's accomplishments over the past 75 years, but also look into the future to make sure that the alliance remains fit for purpose for the challenges ahead. And so to discuss these issues, I'm very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel. Directly to my left, we have Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. She's Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She's also a Senior Fellow with the Belfer Center at Harvard University and a former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. To her left, we have Ian Brzezinski. He's a Senior Fellow in the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. He's also in the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. To his left, we have Elizabeth Braw, a Senior Fellow in the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And then to her left, Dr. John Denny, Professor at the U.S. Army War College and a Senior Fellow in the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center. So welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us. And before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes for our audience. The discussion is, of course, on the record. We will leave time at the end of the discussion for audience questions, so we encourage both our in-person audience and our virtual participants to join the conversation. There's a standing microphone in the room for those of you in person. And for virtual participants, you can log your questions on askac.org. We also invite you to interact with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, by following @Atlantic Council and using our hashtag, #StrongerWithAllies. So with that, let's begin the discussion. Welcome again. And Ian, maybe we'll start with you. And here at the Atlantic Council, we think a lot about NATO, but maybe everybody doesn't think about NATO every day. So what is NATO? What does it do?
Well, Matt, Jenna, thank you for hosting this panel on this important anniversary. 75 years is a long period of time. That alone testifies to the success of the alliance, growing from 12 original signatories that signed the document here in Washington to now 32. What NATO does is it serves as the institutional core of this transatlantic community of democracies. And it was established to mobilize and orchestrate the combined political, economic, and military power of these democracies. And it has done that with great effect. I mean, what NATO is known first and foremost for is its role as a military institution, an organization that can throw lead downrange effectively to deter our adversaries and, when necessary, defeat them. And in this regard, the alliance has been history's most successful alliance. It enabled NATO, the transatlantic community, to win the Cold War without firing a shot. It brought peace to the Balkans. You've seen, my colleagues have seen firsthand Allied forces operating sometimes under the NATO flag in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Their interoperability, their effectiveness, their courage, rooted in the camaraderie and collectiveness fostered through NATO. And it's an alliance that's backed by $55 trillion in GDP. That's almost half, if not more than half, of global GDP. That's a lot of weight. It's 10 times that of Russia, more than twice that of China. And then also, it's backed by the political legitimacy that comes from a community of democracy. I believe that's a real force multiplier. It's a message to our adversaries. It's a motivator for our troops. So these military, economic, and ideological advantages are exactly what NATO brings to the table, and they're important in an age, as Jenna pointed out, of increasing complexity, increasing danger and lethality in the battle space that our armed forces have to operate in.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ian. And you mentioned some of the accomplishments looking back, winning the Cold War without firing a shot. And that's where I'd like to continue, looking back at the history. And so, Ambassador Dobryansky, maybe we'll come to you next. And looking over the 75 years, what do you see as some of the major challenges that the alliance has overcome? And what do you see as some of the major accomplishments?
Well, on this occasion, let me also give my thanks to the Atlantic Council, to Jenna for opening, to you for moderating, and for the Council just commemorating the anniversary. And as we go forward to the summit this summer, hosted by the United States. So what are some of the challenges and accomplishments? I look back. Let's not take it for granted. Ian just mentioned we were first at 12 when it was signed in as the North Atlantic Treaty, and now 32. So one of the challenges at the time was the question about expansion and enlargement, and there were many debates and discussions about it. And by the way, if you asked me at this time, in my lifetime, would I have ever expected Finland or Sweden to become members, I really wasn't sure that would happen in my own lifetime, and here we are. It's not just only the expansion of those core members, but also if you look at it in terms of the number of the NATO non-members across the globe, which is also a very significant attachment and investment to the very purpose of the alliance as you laid out. So one was the whole question of enlargement itself, which has, I think, really moved forward rather thoughtfully and strategically and successfully. And then there's the issue of burden sharing. And I think we'll dive a little bit more into that. But let me at least say that. That's been the question of, what member states put into it. I'll just come fast forward. I think that given the kinds of discussions and debates that have taken place, I look at where we are now. Over half of the members are investing over 2% at a minimum and even over. I'll single out, we had recently the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, who was here speaking at the Council. He mentioned the fact that Poland is putting 4% of its GDP and challenging other countries as NATO members. So this has been an issue, but I think it has moved substantially and significantly in the right direction, where it's a shared and it is burden sharing. Let me mention just another, and that is, I remember the big debates about out of area. And NATO was focused on just the region for all the reasons that Ian stated. And then the question was, well, should it have a role in other places? Afghanistan was one of the ones that loomed large years back. And so here we are at this time. I'm very struck by the fact that Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, actually has been speaking to the issue about the threat from the Indo-Pacific. Here he's referring to China in particular, and what role NATO should have in that regard. To me, that's also a real mark of success. The fact that it has been so unified and successful in terms of the region, but it is looking at what role it can play beyond. So that was a challenge before, and now it's one that actually it really presents engagement. And it's a question before NATO and for the future, and I think we'll dive into that also in our discussion, what form that will take. What does that actually mean for NATO? I'll conclude on this. It's just on the occasion of this anniversary, I was very struck by the fact that Stoltenberg, in releasing the annual report of NATO, he mentioned all the kinds of challenges that are confronting the global community at this time. And he said, but you know what? I'm proud of the fact that we're a stronger alliance. And actually, because of these very challenges, we have become a stronger alliance, even from what we were at the beginning.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ambassador Dobryansky. And sticking with the history, Elizabeth, maybe we'll come to you next. And our CEO, Fred Kemp, has a new piece out today about the 75th anniversary. And he argues that one of the advantages that the founders of NATO had is that the memories of World War II were still fresh, and so that was a motivator. And he quotes President Truman when he signed the NATO treaty on April 4th, 1949, and he said, quote, "Twice in recent years, nations have felt the sickening blow of unprovoked aggression. Our peoples, to whom our governments are responsible, demand that these things shall not happen again. We are determined that they shall not happen again." So how important was that recent memory of World War II in the founding of NATO, and have current NATO leaders maybe forgotten those lessons, maybe acting with less urgency than Truman and the other founders?
Yeah, you're right. We don't have any NATO leaders today who remember World War II. And indeed, actually, some of them don't even remember the Cold War. That's how young leaders are in NATO these days. And I remember my very first experience on the labor market was here at the Atlantic Council many years ago. David Acheson was still around, and he was a tenuous link to those early days of NATO through his father, obviously Dean Acheson. But yes, how do you manage and give purpose to an alliance when you don't know what the ill is that you're trying to prevent because you've never experienced? You can conceptualize it. That is a good problem to have. It is indeed to the credit of NATO that has helped prevent the sort of things that those early leaders had experienced. I think, though, what we do have within NATO is a completely underestimated group of people who have seen some of the bad things people can do to one another and have helped limit that harm. And that is all the soldiers who serve within our armed forces. I think they often underappreciated. These are the men and women of many ages, including very young ages, who do the hard work of NATO on a daily basis, serving in different countries, allied countries, and as you said, Ian, other countries as well, including some countries in experiencing armed conflict. And this is, I think, something that we can draw on. I'm not saying that they should be elevated to Secretary General, but it's hundreds of thousands of people within our countries, across America, and a number of other NATO states as well, who have experienced other NATO states, NATO member states on the ground, have experienced other countries as well on the ground, have incredible expertise and experience serving in as part of NATO, representing NATO, and are as a result phenomenal ambassadors for this alliance. And in fact, I was just talking to somebody the other day who had served somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but anyway, so he had brought with him the dog that had served with him in that country, and he referred to it as a NATO dog. I mean, this is how proud people are of having served within this alliance. So I hope we'll hear from them more now that NATO's turned 75, and we have this incredible mass or group of people who are not policymakers, but represent NATO in the best sort of way on the basis of what they've done.
Wonderful, thanks. Well, the Atlantic Councils was really founded in 1961 to support the transatlantic relationship and support NATO. And I'm glad you mentioned Dean Acheson, because he was a founder of NATO, but also a founder of the Atlantic Council. And in fact, we still have his cabinet chair on the 10th floor. But we don't yet have a NATO dog, so maybe we should get a NATO dog here at the Council. So John, let's go to you next. And there's always been strong bipartisan support for NATO in the United States, but in recent years it's become more politicized. So has NATO benefited the average American? Does it benefit the average American today? Make the case.
Matt, I think it does. I think there are 4 big reasons how it does. But before I explain that, let me first mention that because I'm a U.S. government employee, the views I express are my own. Let's start with the bedrock of the alliance, and that's the values that we all share, right? This is a community of democracies for the most part. Now, admittedly, some countries have had maybe a mixed relationship with that. Portugal, one of the founding members, couldn't really be called a democracy until the early 70s. Some countries have moved farther away from the ideal, but generally, this is a community that shares our values, and that's important for us for the second reason, and that is at the strategic level, competing with our adversaries, engaging with them, and defending our interests, right? When we talk about strategic competition with the Chinese or the Russians, the allies that we have are really our comparative advantage. Russians, Chinese, they don't have the same array of allies that we do across the globe, centered, anchored really in Europe and the transatlantic space. That brings me to the third reason why NATO is still a good value for Americans today, and that is at the material level. This is a bit of a dive into the operational weeds, but we really couldn't do what we do in the world without having allies by our side. I'm thinking about the burden that they shared, for example, in the surge in Afghanistan. They provided about 1/3 of the troops that were involved in that surge. Although the alliance per se was not involved in Iraq in an operational way, allies in Europe contributed again about 1/3 to the surge in Iraq. More recently, and outside the military realm, we couldn't have pulled Iran to the negotiating table over its nuclear arsenal without Europeans engaging in the same sanctions regime that we did. And then most recently, perhaps, what we see now unfolding in Ukraine. That's really a burden-sharing good news story. There, the European allies are outpacing the Americans in terms of commitments in military, financial, and humanitarian terms. But let me now turn to the fourth, and from my perspective, the most important reason why NATO and our European allies matter to Americans, and that's economics. It's a bit ironic of me to suggest this because economics is barely mentioned in NATO's founding treaty, which we're celebrating this week. However, if we look back at the history of why NATO was founded, it was really founded as a way of consolidating the security and stability in Europe and allowing Europe to sort of rise from the ashes of World War II. That economic relationship was vital to the U.S. economy, and it's even vital today, as vital as it was back then, arguably. Today, the trade and investment relationship between our country and Europe is around $1.5 trillion. That is twice the trade and investment relationship we have with China. If you look at jobs, 5 million American jobs are directly tied to European companies operating in our country. In contrast, Chinese firms support about 160,000 American jobs. So from my perspective, Matt, because we know that capital flees instability, and stability in Europe is vital to their economy and to ours, economics is really the most important reason for why this relationship in the alliance matters out on Main Street.
Well, thanks, John, and you provoked some responses. I see a couple of the other panelists want to jump in on this. So, Paula, would you like to go first?
All right, and then
No, you go first.
Elizabeth, I know, had her hand. I was inspired by your response, and I was thinking, well, my opening only addressed certain points, but there were other points to be addressed. And one of which is, as you were speaking, and you emphasized the importance of the camaraderie, the alliance, that we can't achieve our own necessarily security interests alone, that it certainly adds to our base. It reminded me of 9/11 and the fact that on 9/11 that Article 5 was invoked. And we'll let Ian, of course, elaborate on Article 5, but certainly the attack on one is attack on all. And this was so consequential because it was the first and only time that Article 5 had ever been invoked. And it just speaks to the strength of that importance of the alliance, that other countries were prepared to step forward and to think about what are the ramifications. The other thing that you also made me think of is, in terms of a change from the beginning to the present, is also just even the change of warfare. And that was built into your question because of thinking of cyber, thinking of all the new technological dimensions, how also there's a real advantage economically, militarily, to actually collaborating together in the context of the alliance. So those are the 2 points I wanted to mention, but you definitely reminded me of Article 5 and the fact that other countries in the alliance immediately invoked Article 5 on behalf of the United States and the attack on us on 9/11.
Great, thanks. An important point, Paula, 9/11 being the only time Article 5 was invoked. That's an important reminder. Elizabeth.
I was just going to add to what John said about the value that NATO provides for American taxpayers. And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about NATO here. It clearly has a number of problems that we may address later. But one aspect I don't think gets enough credit or any credit at all is the fact that it gives U.S. service members an opportunity to serve in different countries and get this sort of experience, not just working, but cultural experience that as a university student you have to pay big money to get. So I saw the other day some group of American soldiers in Poland had been making a study visit somewhere. But that's something that ordinarily you only get if you go on a semester or a year abroad, and that is expensive. And if you serve within the U.S. military, you can go, if you're selected, you can go to one of the NATO member states where the U.S. military has a presence, and you get to work there, but you also get to experience the country, which is why the U.S. military, it's one of the reasons why the U.S. military has more exposure, more cultural understanding of other countries than I think almost any other part of U.S. society. I mean, that is incredible value for money.
Mm-hmm. Ian.
If I could just, on a simple burden-sharing fact, whenever NATO undertakes a military operation in support of U.S. interests, every European soldier that participates in that mission basically accounts for 3 U.S. soldiers that don't have to participate. Because for every soldier you have in the field, you have one that's resting up for the mission and one's training up for the mission. So in 2011, when there were 40,000 Europeans, 40,000 non-American troops serving under ISAF, there was 120,000 Americans that didn't have to serve in a combat zone. That's very effective burden sharing. That's a very real asset for the United States that NATO provides.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a great look back, and we can go back to the history, but I would also like to look forward. And of course, we have the NATO summit coming up this summer, historic summit, 75th anniversary, will be held here in Washington. And the Atlantic Council is honored to once again be selected by NATO as one of the official partners for putting on the public forum. So we're looking forward to that. And likely to be several major themes at the summit: deterrence and defense, future of Ukraine, burden sharing, NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific. For the first time, a NATO strategic concept featured China prominently recently. So let's look at some of the major challenges for the summit and ahead for the alliance. And Paula, maybe we'll start with you. Okay. Any of these topics, I know Ukraine is of interest, but Indo-Pacific as well, but wherever you'd like to take it.
Well, those will be the 2 I'll take on, and then we'll pass it down the line here. I think that the summit, one of the key questions will be Ukraine's membership in NATO. And I think that I think it's crucial that the summit demonstrates that not only membership to Ukraine should be extended definitively and clearly, but secondly, that it's not just only about the extension of it, but actually the beginning of the process. The Atlantic Council actually did sponsor a letter which was nonpartisan. You have Republicans, Democrats, independents who came together and basically wrote in the letter how this summit provides the opportunity to formally and actively begin the accession process. And I was one of the signatories. There were many others who were signatories to this. But specifically, I think the summit has to highlight that issue, and in a way which isn't going back to Bucharest. It moves from Bucharest and certainly moves on from Vilnius. I think that the signal that it sends is an imperative one. It's a critical one. You mentioned deterrence. That is crucial in terms of sending a signal about deterrence relative to Ukraine and in its fight for its own sovereignty, its virtual independence, and freedom from Russian aggression. So on that one, definitely, I think there has to be clarity, U.S. leadership on this, and a way in which we move forward very directly. Now, I know there are going to be challenges to this. Of course, there are. Not all the countries are embracing this approach, but to me, between now and then, this is something that we have to work on aggressively and think about how to send a clear signal forward that that process is en route actively. And then, secondly, with regard to the Indo-Pacific, one of the core questions before NATO is what kind of arrangement NATO should have in the Indo-Pacific. I'm very glad that Stoltenberg and NATO itself has been actively pursuing this. There's a debate and a discussion about what form and shape that should take. I think that it is appropriate to look for some kind of permanent presence in the Indo-Pacific region. The manifestation could be that of a kind of a facility, a mission, and no less in terms of our own military assets in this regard. And that could also take different shapes and forms. But again, as you started with, the very first point was about deterrence. That's very a core responsibility of NATO. And in that regard, I think that both of these issues are really key ones, which will be spotlighted this summer when the United States hosts the NATO summit.
Great, thanks, Paula. Good points on Ukraine and NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific. And Ian, I know you've also written on what NATO should be doing in the Indo-Pacific, but have thoughts on these other topics as well. So where should the alliance be headed?
Let me just focus on what I think will be the defining issue for this summit. Is a defining issue also when it comes to NATO's future. I really believe that NATO's future is found in the outcome of this defense against Russia's invasion. NATO's future, its credibility as a deterrent institution, is going to be found in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to be the defining contextual driver of this summit. It is going to define the summit. And what I'm concerned of is that if we have a summit in the context of a Ukraine that it continues to be at stalemate or is losing territory, regardless if we give it a path to NATO membership or not, if it's not put on a winning track, this is a summit that's going to really damage NATO's credibility. Because how is it that an alliance with a GDP of $55 trillion, a defense budget of $1.2, $1.3 trillion, not to mention the best fighting forces in the world, is unable to defeat an adversary that's 1/25 of its GDP. Russia's GDP is about $1.8 billion. Its defense budget somewhere between $88 and $120 billion, 1/10 that of NATO. And as we've seen, quite graphically, its fighting forces are no match to that of NATO. So what does it say about NATO if it convenes this summit and Ukraine is not winning this war decisively. If we're going to have a successful summit, a summit that's going to inspire confidence in the alliance's continued ability to deter aggression, this summit has to put Ukraine onto a path to victory. And to do that, it's going to require basically 5 things. It's going to be requiring the alliance to adopt Ukraine's war objectives, total territorial reconstitution. Anything short of that is dissolution of the Ukrainians and the wrong message to the Russians. 2, and this group, this community knows this, we've got to give Ukraine the weapons they need now, at the pace they need, at the rate they need, the volume they need, the capability they need, and without restrictions on how they're used against legitimate Russian military targets in Russia. Third, we've got to engage the Russian people. Weaponize truth. We've got to tell the Russian people what's going on in Ukraine, how it's affecting them, the atrocities that their own people are committing. We're not doing that like we used to do that during the Cold War. We've got to have serious economic sanctions. The fact that Russia's economy grew by 3% last year shows it's something profoundly inadequate about our strategy and our political will. And then finally, I agree completely with Paula. The win strategy for Ukraine's got to include a clear path into NATO membership, not just after the war has ended, which we don't know when will happen, but it's part of the win strategy because Article 5 is the only thing Putin understands and respects when it comes to communicating that Ukraine is not for the taking.
Thanks, Ian. And the war in Ukraine is certainly going to be a major issue at the summit this summer. Another major issue will be burden sharing, and this has been an issue throughout the history of the alliance, but it's been taking on more salience recently. Elizabeth, you're our European representative on the panel. What do you make of these American complaints that the Europeans aren't pulling their weight, and what do you see as burden sharing and the future of the alliance more broadly after the summit?
Yeah, I think there is a great deal of unfairness when people say Europe should do this or Europe should do that. And there are a number of Europeans here in the room who know that the contributions among European member states are quite differ from one another. And so some are one might argue even more committed to NATO than is the US, and some not so much. So credit to them, and maybe let's call out the ones the laggards rather than Europe as a continent. But I think one of the basic challenges for NATO is sort of a positive one, which is that it's a victim of its own success. People want it to be lots of things that it didn't intend to be 75 years ago on this day when it set out to defend the territory of those original member states, and that was it. There was nothing about hybrid warfare, obviously nothing about the Indo-Pacific or any of that. And now, understandably, people looking at NATO, seeing a successful alliance, wanted to be more, wanted to do more. And that also, I think, is linked to deterrence. So how do we create the deterrence when we want NATO to do many more things than it was originally set up to do? And I think this is where the burden sharing actually looks quite a bit better than it does if you just look at defense spending. A number of European countries have excellent solutions when it comes to societal resilience. And resilience is one part of deterrence. The US is not very good at societal resilience for reasons having to do with geography and maybe culture. But the advantage of having all these different allies in NATO is that you have a group of countries right there from whom you can learn, who have models that may work, and if they don't work 100%, you can adapt them. And that's another great thing about having this alliance. It's not just, I think, as you said, John, it's not just about the immediate function of NATO. It's the fact that you have friends at the ready who can help you. For example, just as we speak, Sweden is introducing a national grid type of national service. Well, what if that might be a solution for other NATO member states? I think it would be, and even for the United States. Then you have a country right there that is willing to tell you how it works and how they've set it up, and give you the blueprint for how to do it.
Wonderful. John, I'd like to ask you about deterrence and defense. Last year at the NATO summit, NATO agreed to these new regional plans. Mm-hmm. They've been described as maybe the first real serious defense plans for NATO since the end of the Cold War. Does NATO have the right strategy for deterrence and defense? Does it have the force structure it needs? Tell us a little bit about where NATO stands on these issues.
Well, Matt, there's been a real evolution in the alliance's approach to this topic. Speaking of burden sharing, starting in 2014, Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, the alliance really began to turn around its defense spending, first and foremost. We've seen an uptick since 2015. That effort has now been on steroids since 2022 in Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, the alliance has gotten far more serious about its approach to Russia at the strategic level, issuing a new strategic concept in 2022 that identified Russia as the primary threat. Very different than, in contrast to what the alliance said in 2010 in its last strategy. If we take a step down at the operational level, here's where we see the alliance really beginning to engage in a more deliberate process of thinking about how it would respond to Russian aggression on Allied territory. And so we saw last year the alliance approve an array, a new set of operations plans designed specifically to counter Russian aggression in different parts of Europe. We're seeing unfold now this year the development of more tactical, regional-specific plan, domain-specific plans that will further flesh out what NATO needs, where, and how quickly. The challenge the alliance has, of course, is resourcing all of that. Now, as I mentioned, the first part of that is increased defense spending. That's all going in the right direction. I have concerns, though, that it's not occurring quickly enough and at a degree that's great enough in the big players. And by that, I mean within Europe, the UK, France, Germany, and Italy. Those four countries together account for about 2/3 of European NATO defense spending. And although their defense spending has been trending upwards, as I mentioned, since 2015, it's not going up at a pace that's high enough, fast enough. If those four aren't pulling their weight at a significant level, it's difficult for NATO to meet both the capability and the capacity requirements to make good on these new plans. And so I think there's some risk there. I think the alliance is going to try to address this at the summit. We should expect to see a couple of deliverables in this area of defense and deterrence. I'm hopeful that this may be one of them.
Great.
I just wanted
Go
to
ahead,
make
Paula, and then Ian.
I flagged him before you did, Ian. I was going to say, I just wanted to make 3 quick points. First, Ian, to you, I really wanted to underscore Ian's point about the upcoming summit and the fact that it is a pivotal and defining moment, this whole question about Ukraine. And it will send a clear signal. I think you well articulated, and I agree with all the points that you made in terms of the consequences if the summit does not have clarity on this issue and really take a very clear and bold stance. Secondly, I wanted to comment briefly, Elizabeth. The interesting thing, I think the Atlantic Council is hosting, I believe it's this week or maybe it's next, actually a session that's going to focus on the contributions of Europe. And I was very struck by that, particularly relative to Ukraine. And I think that's important because it is true, as she said, there are so many countries that have stepped forward and actually in certain spheres doing much greater and much faster steps than the United States. Fighter aircraft is one of them that a number of countries have moved forward very significantly in Europe, and we are still, haven't taken the kind of step that should be taken relative to Ukraine. And last, I just want to mention that I've been very struck by statements made by actually Lithuanian officials. A number of Lithuanian officials have said the following: why doesn't the West stop setting up red lines for itself? Putin doesn't have red lines. Why is it that we are putting red lines for ourselves? I think that really is an important statement to remember here.
Ian, why are we putting red lines for ourselves?
Well, we're putting red lines for ourselves because senior officials in NATO and here in Washington, D.C., fear the risk of nuclear escalation. And this gets to the kind of an issue of not only capability, but political will and resoluteness. The alliance was successful during the Cold War, not only because it was able to generate interoperable, capable military forces and to deploy them and to resource them. It was also able to be successful because it demonstrated a resoluteness, a determination, a willingness to go to battle in defense of alliance territory and alliance values. And nowhere was this more clear than in the case of West Berlin, the isolated enclave in East Germany. It was never attacked because the Soviets knew that if it did get attacked, there would be a forceful response, a military response, unambiguous response from the alliance. So as we go into the NATO summit today, we are going to highlight a lot of progress that John laid out. Increased defense spending, an updated strategic concept, regional plans that are going to more effectively leverage our alliance capabilities, enhanced unity within the alliance. But is the alliance going to demonstrate this summit it still has the will to fight, the resoluteness that made it so successful during the Cold War? And that answer will be provided by what it does and doesn't do on Ukraine. And that's where I'm a little bit worried.
Okay, it looks like both Elizabeth and John want to come in on this question of resoluteness, and then we'll be going to the other participants. Elizabeth.
It is paradoxical, I think, that considering how much the US has done for NATO and still does for NATO, that some policymakers can't resist the urge to say something that then totally undermines it. And then it's as if they've essentially deliberately wiped so many $1 million off what the US does for collective defense. And I know this is the nature of a liberal democracy. We have a vibrant debate within our societies, but sometimes I wish they would just think twice about saying something, because it may be perceived in a certain way in countries that wish us ill and in countries that are America's allies, and it is so harmful. And I think every child is told, think twice before you say something. And I sort of want to remind US policymakers of that good advice to every child in every classroom everywhere.
John, is that good advice to NATO policymakers and everyone?
It may be, but Matt, I wanted to comment on the question of red lines and why we're imposing them. I think Ian's got it right that a big part of the answer is we are concerned with escalation, justifiably so, right? I mean, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. We've got a responsibility to pay attention to that and to think about the consequences of our actions. But I think there's another reason why we've set red lines out, and that is to signal to our own public, both here in the US, but also allied publics, that we're going to limit our engagement. And why is that? Frankly, I think it's a hangover of the last 2 decades in which we've seen ourselves overextended, we the West, in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The best academic estimates of the cost of those conflicts are between $4 and $8 trillion. That doesn't begin to scratch the surface of the impact on lives, not just American lives, but Iraqis, Afghans, and our allies. And so I think this is a concerted effort to signal to our publics, who still have, again, this hangover of these conflicts 2 decades ago, that we're not going to be engaging in that kind of a conflict, at least not yet. Circumstances could dictate otherwise, but I think that's part of the intent in signaling or enunciating these red lines.
A quick comment, Elizabeth?
I just wanted to add one last look back, since we're now moving on from the retrospective, which is that NATO really has been extraordinarily agile. If you think about the way that it's set up, collective leadership, how many collectively led organizations do you know that have been able to adapt to circumstances over 7.5 decades? None, and even companies struggle to adapt when circumstances change. When I was walking over here this morning, I walked past a shop window where there used to be a Kinko's. Does anybody remember Kinko's? That was a thing 20, 30 years ago, where you went to make photocopies and use the internet. Kinko's didn't know how to adapt to the changing times, and now there is no Kinko's there anymore, or indeed anywhere else. NATO has really been incredibly agile, despite being run in this very clunky way. So credit to those leaders who have made it happen, both NATO staff and indeed national leaders.
It's a good point. At the end of the Cold War, you had many international relations scholars saying that NATO's outlived its purpose, it's going to come to an end, and instead it expanded and became stronger. So I have many more questions, but we already have good questions coming in from our online audience, and we have an in-person audience here as well. So I'd like to turn to you for your questions now. For in-person, if you'd like to ask questions, please come up to the microphone over here. That way everybody will be able to hear you, our online participants as well. And if you could identify your name and affiliation, that would be terrific. So let's go to our first in-person question.
Can you hear me?
Si.
Yeah, grazie. Yeah. So I'm a former NATO analyst currently at George Mason University. My question is about the political approach of NATO, the fact that it's the only defender of democracies in the world, And as Mr. Brzezinski said, maybe we don't engage enough with the people around the world, including in Russia. So how to improve the strategic communication of NATO to explain that it is a political military alliance that defends democracies? Thank you very much.
Good question. Who'd like to take that?
Sure. I think,
Ian?
look, during the Cold War, we had a massive organization that basically served as our armed strategic communications arm. Paula was a senior official in that, the United States Information Agency. We mistakenly shut it down in 1998.
It got absorbed into the State Department.
Absorbed, I think, is a generous word, because I think if you look at the State Department today, the Global Engagement Center is what manages it.
Right.
And the Global Engagement Center, I think, has, what, a $60 million budget? USIA, when it closed down, had somewhere between 2 to 3, maybe over $3 billion. It had an infrastructure. It had a director, a deputy director, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries. You had a career in strategic communications at USIA. We kneecapped ourselves by shutting it down. And right now, we're not engaging the Russian people in anywhere way close the way we did during the Cold War, supporting dissidents, getting the truth out, weaponizing truth, and I mean that in a positive way. We're intimidated from doing that because we feel that if we get into that game again, it'll be perceived by Putin as a direct attack on his regime and could create a risk of escalation. It's a profound mistake that's weakening our ability to change the course of this war in Ukraine, to change Russia itself into a more constructive path, maybe one that could even be more oriented towards democracy and a more constructive role in international affairs.
I'll just add on to that. I think, sir, your question is a very relevant one. It's one that's crucial because it's not only about the military component, and it's not only, and well stated, about the economic dimension of it, as John well articulated, but it is about the political glue that makes it stick and run. And in that sense, actually, I think there was a period where we were a bit complacent in terms of, in an earlier period of our alliance. We took a number of things for granted. Ian's right in saying, and you are right in saying, there has to be great activism in that, because these are these values that really bind us together. I will mention on the positive side, and you're right, I do agree with everything you've said, Ian, but on the positive side, I do think the fact that NATO has the non-NATO member status, I'm amazed. There are so many countries across the globe and every continent that fits into that category. And why? Because of the values. They're drawn into the values and also the actual underpinning of what the alliance really means.
Great.
And I'll just
Elizabeth, please.
One thing, which is one of NATO's challenges is that there are many people who like it very much and who like to spend a career sort of in the NATO sphere, either inside the organizations or in think tanks or national governments, and they then become the face of NATO, and they don't realize how differently NATO looks to people on the outside. And obviously, if you're part of the choir of the converted, then obviously you love it. So I think what would be really useful for NATO is to invite representatives on a regular basis, representatives from other parts of society, environmental activists, the Gretas of the world. They are convinced they don't like NATO. Well, if they were to find out what NATO is about, they may see it in a different light. Business leaders, those sorts of people, and that I'm not saying that I don't know where the gentlemen there they are. I don't know whether that would convince Russia that NATO isn't the sort of belligerent organization that Russia likes to portray it as, but at least it would help NATO acquire a somewhat different profile and hopefully a more positive one in the view of the many who are not part of the sort of NATO groupie network.
We have many good questions coming in online, and John, maybe a first one for you, because you were talking about some of the difficulties of resourcing our strategy. So this question says, in the lead up to the Washington summit, analysts have discussed the idea of a new defense spending target. And of course, the 2% was set at Wales 10 years ago. At the summit last year, I think the phrase was 2% is a floor, not a ceiling. But this says, can you discuss why allies would shift to a new target when many allies fail to meet the current one? What else can the alliance be doing to ensure it's able to resource its new defense plans and ensure the alliance is equipped with the tools it needs to be successful on battlefields of the future?
Well, this is a great question considering the challenges the alliance faces right now. And I'll note that the 2% goal actually precedes Wales. The Wales summit in 2014 was just the first instance in which the heads of state and government committed to that pledge. It was previously made by defense ministers who would then go back to Capitol and try to duke it out with their finance ministers or their treasuries to get the money they had committed to in Brussels. So now that we have this commitment of 2% of GDP, which, by the way, my sense is that's a very crude measurement of burden sharing. NATO actually tracks nearly a dozen other measures. Only one or two of them are made public. I think the alliance could do a better job in maybe sharing some of this information regarding what we really see in terms of burden sharing, not just the inputs, but the outputs the alliance gets for its money. But as we look to what's about to unfold this year, you mentioned, Matt, that we saw 2% described as a floor last year in Vilnius. In fact, a careful reading of the Wales summit language would indicate 2% was already viewed as kind of a floor. So I don't think what happened last year in Vilnius was really very new or added much. I've been an advocate of something along the lines of 2.4 and 24, but I think the alliance is not going to commit to any kind of new defense spending target. And the reason for that is it would show disunity within the alliance. There's not a consensus on this about committing to a new percentage of GDP for defense spending. And let's remember that the job of every summit, especially one held in Washington, is to depict unity as much as we possibly can. And so a disagreement about where the mark should be, that would not be productive. Now, how can the alliance get beyond this challenge? We've seen suggestions floated, for example, the allies could perhaps issue, at least in Europe, could perhaps issue bonds. The EU has spoken about doing this for defense spending. That may be a solution, but I think, frankly, it masks the deeper challenge. And that is, namely, the defense budgets of individual alliance members. Going into debt is one way to solve this problem, but it's not an effective way. I think there needs to be a stronger re-examination of the priorities of our European allies. And this touches on, frankly, the last question about messaging. NATO, I think, can do more to message what the threats are that confront the allies, how they're manifesting themselves today in our countries, especially in Europe. I'm thinking specifically of the threat posed by China today in Europe. If we can get our citizens to realize the nature of the challenge we face, as we've seen since 2014, defense spending can and will rise. But it's getting that message across to our citizens and then having the politicians ideally have the political courage to act on that.
By the way, a 30-second, on the messaging, I just happened 2 weeks ago to be in NATO headquarters with a group that was there and received by the Public Affairs Division. They have an outstanding Public Affairs Division, meaning in terms of what they articulate, how they put it together, but I don't know how much they get out and around rather than people coming into NATO. And that was your point also.
When we're trying to do our part today with this event, which is being covered by C-SPAN to get the message out. So doing what we can. And as part of that, we'll turn to our next in-person question. So again, if you could please tell us your name and affiliation, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Rauf Bajrovic, US-Europe Alliance here in Washington, D.C. My question is going to be quick for Mr. Brzezinski. You spoke about the need to put Ukraine on a path to victory. What is victory for Ukraine?
Victory of Ukraine is defined by the president and the parliament, and I think it's supported by the vast majority of the Ukrainian people. Total territorial reconstitution back to its 1991 borders.
Thank you very much.
And here at the Atlantic Council, we interviewed Celeste Wallander, an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Biden administration. We asked her this question, and she said, well, that's Ukraine's goal, and we support Ukraine in their goal.
The problem, Matt, is that you can look at alliance communiques, and it will call for the removal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. But unfortunately, the administration and NATO allies don't always use such clear terms. They talk about an independent and sovereign Ukraine and don't mention at all territory, inferring either intentionally or unintentionally that there could be a compromise outcome that would be acceptable to the West. That, I think, is a wrong message to be sending. We should be much clearer. I'm glad that Celeste Wallander was clear in that. I hope her other colleagues in the U.S. government and across NATO will be just as clear.
And by the way, the questioner, your question was so relevant because others tried to answer it when Ukraine has already answered it very clearly.
Here, here.
And has been very consistent on that.
Okay, we're running short on time, and I have what I think is a great question to maybe end on, and a good forward-looking question. So it says, we talked about NATO expansion, of course, over the years after the end of the Cold War. The question says, Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO means NATO's bench is now at 32 allies, with other countries like Ukraine knocking at NATO's door. What is the state of NATO enlargement beyond Ukraine? It seems that enlargement debate is primarily focused on Ukraine and less so on places such as Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia. So who are if we come back in 75 years, who are the new NATO members who will have been admitted? Anybody want to take that?
My answer immediately is I think the doors should be open to those who want to become part of the alliance. Georgia, in particular, of the countries mentioned there, has been very actively pursuing NATO membership. I think that those that want to become part of the alliance and also are willing to also be part of the, if you will, the requirements of the alliance should be able to come in and do so.
Okay, and with just a few minutes left, maybe we should also make this kind of a closing round. So the NATO enlargement or any other issues, we come back 75 years from now, what are the issues that the alliance is going to have to tackle between now and then?
Looking forward, first and foremost, is ensuring that Ukraine wins. That is the most urgent task before the alliance. Second is, with the Ukrainian victory and the extension of NATO membership to Ukraine as part of that win strategy, NATO has to demonstrate that it's going to willingly accept the applications of other Europeans, be it the Georgians, the Moldovans, maybe some others in the Western Balkans, to complete the vision of a Europe that's whole, free, and secure. And then third, I would say, is establishing, as Paula was saying, a footprint in the Indo-Pacific, so we can be part of a comprehensive transatlantic security strategy to deal with the challenges and opportunities of that region. A strategy that has a diplomatic dimension, an economic dimension, a political dimension, but also a military dimension. And NATO can serve as that kind of coordinative role for the transatlantic community in that dimension. Those, I think, are the key challenges before the alliance over the next 75 years.
Thanks. Elizabeth?
Climate change. It's got to be climate change, and not just related to how much CO2 armed forces emit. That's sort of a small and technical issue. Climate change will cause enormous problems, national security problems of all kinds, including armed conflicts between countries relating to resources, but also even more urgent for Europe, growth in population movements as people's home countries become uninhabitable. That is a severe national security challenge for every European country, and there's no clear answer to what to do about it, but NATO is a defense alliance or national security alliance involving mostly European countries. So it's something that will be coming NATO's way, regardless of whether or not one thinks we're doing enough to combat climate change. NATO will have to confront whatever the results are of this really looming problem that we don't have an answer to. Over.
John.
Matt, I think the greatest challenge the alliance faces is coming to the realization, it's been slow in coming, that the challenge that we face from Russia is not merely an acute one, but a persistent one. Now, our allies in the East, that is the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Finland, they get this. But it's been slow for Americans to grasp this, and I think, and we have the notion that we can somehow park the Russian threat, turn to the Indo-Pacific, and let the Europeans kind of handle things there. That's unrealistic. First of all, there are incredible connections, relationships between these two theaters. We cannot ignore that. And so recognizing that there can no longer be a buffer zone between the West and Russia and managing the friction that is inevitable is the greatest challenge the alliance will face.
Paula, final brief comment.
Mine is great power competition. I think in that sense, the alliance is absolutely key and pivotal in this geopolitical challenge confronting Western values and what we represent.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I have many more questions, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. So I want to thank our distinguished panelists for your time and sharing your expertise today. The Atlantic Council will continue in our mission of shaping the global future together, and nowhere is this mission more important than conversations like today's. It's been a pleasure to moderate today's event. I encourage all of you to stay engaged with the Atlantic Council and the Transatlantic Security Initiative, especially as we accelerate our campaign toward the 2024 NATO summit. Don't go anywhere. We have another panel coming up. In our next panel, we're thrilled to feature a group of next-generation experts and leaders from across the alliance who will take part in a panel discussion, NATO at 75, looking ahead to the next 75 years. That panel will begin in 15 minutes, and it will be moderated by Alexandra Sharp, the world brief writer at Foreign Policy. So thank you all again very much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next panel.
Thank you.
Matt, I'm a little disturbed that we weren't included in
Thank you to the previous panel for that engaging discussion on NATO's enduring legacy. My name is Alexandra Sharp, and I am the writer of Foreign Policy's flagship newsletter, World Brief. Given that today is the 75th anniversary of NATO, I'm thrilled to host a conversation to explore the future of the alliance and ways to bolster NATO's defense and deterrence. And to help me answer these questions, I'm joined by a distinguished panel of next-generation experts. So please help me welcome Luca Ignatz, an assistant director for the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Wave a little hello.
Welcome to you.
Sissy Martinez, program manager and research associate for the Center for Strategic and International Studies' Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. Jason Moyer, a program associate at the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. And Krista Vixnans, a senior program officer with the Transatlantic and Defense program at the Center for European Policy and Analysis. Thank you guys for joining. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping for you guys. This discussion is on the record. At the end, we're going to leave some time for some audience questions. There is a standing microphone right over there for in-person participants. And for virtual participants, please feel free to log your questions at askac.org. We also encourage you to interact with us on X, Twitter, by following @Atlantic Council and using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. All right, so I wanted to kick off the conversation with all of you guys. So NATO is facing an increasingly complex and volatile global security landscape now and in the future. In your view, what do you anticipate being the biggest challenge for the alliance in the next 75 years? Jason, you want to start us off?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing this discussion. What is the greatest challenge facing NATO? I think in the near term, there's really no argument that Russia is going to be the greatest challenge facing the NATO alliance. Between its kinetic warfare and its increasingly aggressive stance towards its neighbors, Russia is going to be very much the near-term challenge. Looking further down the line, I think in the long run, China will be sort of the larger existential challenge, not so much for NATO as an alliance, but for the collective West. We can talk more about that in a little bit, but I would say Russia.
Okay.
So I could easily say Russia, China, just what Jason said, but I actually think that the biggest challenge to the alliance will be ourselves. Maintaining cohesion, maintaining unity, I think will probably be the biggest test to the alliance, given the ever-changing security environment, whether new threats from Russia emerge or in China and the Indo-Pacific. I do think keeping that unity within the alliance, remembering our core tasks and sticking to our core tasks, and kind of remembering why we're here at the end of the day, I think that will be the biggest challenge.
All right.
I couldn't agree more with both of my colleagues here, but I think in addition to that, there is a really important part of thinking about the future of NATO and challenges specifically that we're going to face, especially I would say our generation and those to come after us, which is maintaining the U.S. interest and engagement in NATO. That's been something that I think inevitably is already being questioned and it's already being debated, right? How to maintain the U.S. engagement, how to maintain not only in the NATO itself, but also in the transatlantic security. What can we as the alliance, but also as European allies, as well as the U.S. itself, do to reinvigorate a transatlantic alliance? And I think that's something that I'm not sure if we've found the answer just yet. I think so far NATO has really been going sort of from crisis to crisis to try and find that new resolve, new impetus to start to sort of revive the alliance. If we think about it, it was just in, I think, 2019 where it was the famous brain dead speech from President Macron on NATO. And now we seem like we're sort of a whole world apart from that. But it's important to maintain that sort of the currency of the alliance, give it really the weight that it needs and the importance that it needs to survive, to not just live from crisis to crisis, but to go beyond that. And I think another important factor when it comes to the challenges facing the alliance is, adapting to the challenges of the battlefield of tomorrow. And in particular, what I want to talk about here is the hybrid threats and sort of the multi-domain operations and and how we're going to need to think about the future of warfare. I think we spend a lot of time presently talking about sort of the traditional threats that exist in the alliance, and a lot of that comes from the fact that we have forgotten about investing in our militaries, or sort of put it as a second priority when it comes to producing arms and specific weapon systems, and also making sure that we have enough in our stocks to be able to defend our territories. But at the same time, we need to start actively thinking, what are the steps we can take as the alliance, as individual member states, to prevent that from happening in the future, not only in the traditional realm, but also when it comes to sort of the threats in the cyber realm, in the space realm, and we could talk about this a little bit later. So I think there are various challenges here that are facing the alliance, and all of that I think are equally sort of important. Russia and China, absolutely, but I think beyond that, there are also just the threats that actually the alliance will be facing that we still don't know, but we need to start actively preparing for.
Krista?
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Alexandra, for moderating this great discussion today. Of course, my colleagues are all right here, everything they have said so far. I would like to push back and in one word, say NATO's relevance. I think that's the biggest challenge that the alliance is going to face. We, all of us here online and in person, we are NATO nerds. We are fans of this great club. But there are plenty of people in United States and member countries around the world that don't know what NATO does. And I think if NATO really wants to survive for the next 75 years, we have to demonstrate to constituents, to voters, whatever, to make sure that there is future funding, that countries are spending more than 2% on GDP, hopefully 3% very soon. So I think, again, we are in a privileged club of people here that agree and know the value of the alliance. But I think, if you want an organization like NATO to last another 75 years, you're going to have to demonstrate. I mean, I'm from Minnesota originally, in the Midwest. Lots of well-informed people that just don't know what is NATO, what does it do, is Ukraine partner? I mean, the questions that I get from, I like to think, well-informed friends, should be concerning when we're thinking about the future of the alliance. So, yes, in one word, I would say NATO's relevance.
I want to stick with you for a second, Krista. NATO, as you mentioned, is facing a fundamentally different world than it once did. When it was founded in 1949, it had different priorities. Now we've got the rise of cyber warfare, we have new security threats, we have plenty of nations around the world that are not NATO's biggest fans. Is the alliance falling short in its responsibilities, and should there be a certain area the alliance should be investing in more?
Yes, I mean, I think first and foremost, I always do believe that NATO needs to focus on security and defense and stick to what it's good at. While NATO is learning that we need to dabble in things like climate change and future technologies that present problems when it comes to AI, autonomous systems, et cetera, I think that's important. But I think the real challenge is not spreading ourselves too thin and making sure that NATO does what it does best, and that is security and defense alone.
Can I also just
Please.
add to that? I think so far our conversation has touched on the many different arenas the many different problems that NATO is facing, challenges that us and our allies are facing. But it's highlighting the fact that there's just so much. And I think to that, it's also important to remind ourselves that there's also so much that NATO can do. I also think it's important to see that NATO can't be everywhere, NATO can't do everything. And I think that realistic conversation, I don't know if it's being had. I would like to think it's being had. Also understanding where our gaps are, where we can fill, but maybe in areas that we cannot fill. Looking to other partnerships worldwide, or if there are other countries that can contribute in different ways as opposed to others. I think that question of will versus the question of capacity, the question of will being the US and then looking at the capacity issue through the European lens, that's also fundamentally important because we don't want to stretch ourselves too thin, like Krista said, but also recognizing that we can't do everything.
And if I can also just add, I think one of the ways that NATO could invest more is invest in itself. look to the burgeoning calls for greater EU defense cooperation. This is an area where traditionally there hasn't been a lot of dialogue between NATO and the EU. Just the other day, Secretary Blinken was in Paris, and he reaffirmed that the United States, is open to and encourages European allies to be able to do more to contribute to their own defense. Some of this begins with investing in the European defense industry, which has historically been massively underfunded. It's very fragmented along national lines. The EU just recently put out a defense industrial strategy showing that they're aware of this and they're working to fix it. So this is the kind of thing that NATO can start to do at home within the capital of Brussels, just to begin to have these better conversations between European countries and NATO allies.
And Luca, I want to kind of going off this, you have a strong work background with European defense. And as you said, we are seeing, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a major defense buildup within the European defense structure. What role should NATO be playing in this transformation, if any?
Yeah, I think NATO definitely continues to play an important role in kind of serving as the convening space for all the allies, and in order to make the determination of what are really our joint security priorities, transatlantic security priorities. But I think most importantly, NATO needs to have an active role in shaping the European security architecture, and that's, I think, to me, the most important aspect of sort of any kind of nascent European efforts, or specifically when it comes to the defense industry. Not to say that that means that Europe should only look towards NATO when it comes to developing its own initiatives or rearming or developing its own industry and investing in it. But it does matter that NATO has sort of the experience of the 75 years, but also it provides the expertise, and it provides the convening space for the allies to come together and again determine really what is the right way to proceed with this, and where are the gaps in the alliance's capabilities, where can Europe step in the most in order to help the alliance move beyond just the simple sort of traditional defense tasks also, and think about the crisis management, and be less so of an alliance that responds to the crisis and to the wars and to the specific threats, but more so an alliance that to some extent also shapes peace and has a role in shaping peace globally. And I think, to me, that is a role of sort of, and that's why European efforts are going to be specifically needed. And I think Secretary Blinken's remarks in Paris just before he went for the NATO ministerial in Brussels were really symbolic to some extent, because when you think about the famous Secretary Albright's speech, where she was warning sort of about how and under what conditions the European defense efforts should be developing, this really is a massive step forward from the US side. However, I think the bigger issue is that we now need to find who in Europe is willing to really start leading the way, and to see just a little bit more than words of support for the European defense initiatives. This is something that's going to include and require a lot of resources, a lot of time, and also a lot of coordination. And Europe will also need to grapple with some very difficult decisions when it comes to how to manage its own defense and security, and within which framework primarily to deal with this. But this is, I feel like, an academic discussion that if we start delving in, we can take an hour and a half into those specifics.
And then I also, within more recent news, we have Sweden within the last month joining NATO. We had Finland joining the year before. Are we seeing a new wave of NATO expansion, and how might that impact the alliance's dynamic with other countries, with Russia in particular? Jason, maybe you want to start with this. I know you have a background in the Nordic region.
Yeah, happy to. This is an issue I've been following very closely for the Wilson Center. Finland and Sweden are both incredible additions to the NATO alliance. They are both they are some of the most capable militaries in all of Europe. Adding them to NATO not only allows for a more secure Baltic Sea region, but also brings a tremendous amount of Arctic know-how to the NATO alliance as a whole. I just talk about specific examples. Sweden has an incredible fleet of submarine capabilities in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is very shallow. It's very salinated. Currently, U.S. the United States doesn't have a lot of submarines that can operate in that particular sea. So just that alone is a tremendous addition to the alliance. And I think it's also reflective of how these two countries view the security environment in Europe. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk of where's Russia going next. A lot of attention is being paid to Moldova in particular, and this is where both Finland and Sweden had these intense debates at home whether the EU security Article 42.7 that has kind of been brought up in more recent years, whether that would be enough or whether NATO and its Article 5 commitment for security would really be the way to go. And we know now that they opted for that. So,
Yeah.
I'd happily jump in as a Latvian American. Have to say how excited we as the Baltics are to have our neighbors to the north, Sweden and Finland, joining the alliance. I think many Baltics have sounded the alarm bells for years, warning about Russia. I think the U.S. included was skeptical. Unfortunately, they were right, as demonstrated by Russia's illegal invasion in Ukraine 2 years ago. But I think that it's, the Baltics couldn't be happier to have our friends to the north. I know the first panel here today, was reminding many people, a generation older than us, thought that this was just truly impossible, that they would never see in their lifetime Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. And I think it's just truly wonderful. I think I also have to give a plug. I'm sure all of us here are in support of Ukraine, hopefully joining the alliance as well. And I think the door also needs to be open for Georgia and Bosnia as well, and others that want to join in the future. I think we are stronger together as a more unified alliance and as Europe with more friends in the club.
Luca?
And yeah, if I can jump in, I think one of the issues that to me seem to be a really important challenge for NATO going forward is how to maintain the credibility of the open door policy. And that's been something particularly on my mind because, we have the question of Ukraine's membership, which is something that often gets, a lot of attention in the media. And I think all of us can agree or hope that really the credibility of that promise to Ukraine will come to fruition and we will see Ukraine become a member of NATO soon. I think when it comes to the other countries, I think it's going to be other countries that are either NATO partner countries or have expressed interest in sort of coming closer to the alliance. I think it's going to be really important for NATO to demonstrate still that appeal of becoming a member of the alliance and the value of being a member of the alliance. And in particular, the reason why I'm saying this is, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julie Smith, just recently had a press remarks before the NATO ministerial, and she warned about the increasing Russian, the destabilizing influence across Europe, but in particular in the Balkans. And as a Croat myself, I often find it sort of incredible to the extent to which Russia has really managed to infiltrate itself within sort of every pore of life in the Western Balkans. And in doing so is also successfully managing to prevent or sort of slow down significantly the region's full sort of the completion of the region's path towards the NATO, but also the European Union. And when it comes to Bosnia here in particular, that's something that I think is a very strong a very strong sort of movement that's been taking place over the past couple of years. And in particular, I would say since the invasion of Ukraine. And so I think NATO's credibility when it comes to open doors policy is at stake, but also ensuring that perspective and that continued engagement with countries that have expressed interest in NATO remains strong.
How much will the ongoing conflict impact Ukraine and even like the surrounding nations, Moldova, Bosnia, entrance into NATO? Do you think that's going to have a major influence on like the actual ability to join the alliance?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've argued through some of our work at the Wilson Center is that just beginning the NATO accession process does not immediately trigger World War III. It doesn't mean that Article 5 applies. I think that just an invitation to begin those accession talks would be a tremendous signal to Ukraine that its future is in NATO, which we all on this stage all agree with. And I think it would also just really legitimize the fact that they are fighting not on just for their own survival, but on behalf of the entire West. I think this is where just inviting Ukraine to begin those talks would mean so much. And it's something that I really hope, I think there's a lot of talk about whether the Washington summit will see that invitation be extended, and questioning whether that will actually happen. But I think there's nothing to stop those conversations from beginning with Ukraine and with Moldova as well.
Sissy, I want to turn to you for a moment. We've seen a massive surge in far-right populism across NATO members. I mean, we've got Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia, even here in the United States. To what extent has this rise in far-right populism and other democratic threats splintered the alliance? I know we talked about cohesion earlier, and you said that was one of the biggest threats to NATO today.
Well, I agree. It is one of the biggest threats, maintaining that cohesion and sorry, just lost my thought for a second.
You're good.
Happens to the best of us. So when it comes to the threat of the far right in Europe, I think there's a lot of instability about what will happen this next year, both in European elections and the U.S. elections. And I think that we need to be really real with ourselves right now on what that messaging will look like for the summit. The summit essentially is a message. What will come out of the summit is a communique, all in agreement between all the allies. What we see in that communique, still a question yet to remain. Whether or not Ukraine gets an invitation, we will see. But keeping that level of reality will be important here. Maintaining those expectations with the Ukrainians on what this will look like. We all agree that Ukraine will eventually be in NATO. I don't think that will be a tomorrow thing. I don't think that will be in a few months. I think we're still a long ways to go. But I think it's important to kind of keep and build that bridge toward membership. What that looks like, deeper integration into the NATO alliance through interoperability, standards, et cetera. But we'll see how the summit goes in terms of keeping that cohesion, but I do think the framing around the summit will be, this is a NATO birthday party. Everybody's going to be patting ourselves on the backs, like, look at all that we've done in the past 75 years. But there's still a lot that needs to be done, and I really just hope that we're being realistic with ourselves for the summit on what we can and can't do, but also keeping expectations throughout the world.
Yeah, Luca?
So I have a two-pointer, or sort of 2 points here and then a two-pointer, what Sissy was saying as well. I think in terms of your previous question of sort of the effect of the war on the NATO accession process, I think as much as the invasion has reinvigorated discussions about the European enlargement, I think it also brought into sort of debate how we do NATO accession. And I think it's an important debate, right? Because at the end of the day, we've done the NATO accession in a very specific way for a very specific period of time, which is the 75 years, right? And there have been changes in the process to some extent, but like it requires consensus of the allies. It requires certain benchmarks to be met and certain standards to be implemented. And I think when it comes to specifically now thinking about the future of NATO, I think that debate has been a useful movement because it demonstrates that there is thinking about like, well, do we really need all of those things to be met in order to make sure that Europe stays safe and secure? And I think in terms of Ukraine, the debate has been, can we take Ukraine in if part of Ukraine is still invaded and under Russian occupation? And so I think it's an important discussion. We had the question of West Germany in the 50s, and which was relatively similar, but I think this is a very unique situation, and I think it's an important sort of important reminder for NATO that its accession process matters, and it matters what kind of message it sends to the countries that are aspiring to be NATO members. When it comes to populism in particular, I think there have been so many headlines talking about, well, how did Sweden and Finland, why did it take so long? Like the alliance is not united. There are all these issues. But I think at the end of the day, democracy is messy. It takes a while, but it produces results. And the result is that we were able to bring 31 allies in case of Sweden and 30 allies in case of Finland together to agree on a NATO membership, on an offer or acceptance of the NATO membership for both of those countries. And that's not a small feat. It takes a lot of effort in this country to get people to agree on certain things. So imagine doing that for 32 countries. And I think it's an actually, populism comes and goes and ebbs and flows. And it's always going to be here regardless, either on the left or the right. But I think at the end of the day, we should not misinterpret the sort of the debate and the lead up into the accession of a NATO member and automatically assume that it indicates the lack of allied unity, but rather focus on the fact that we are now an alliance of 32, a very strong one, and one that has been able to deliver so far on everything that we have set for ourselves as goals.
Krista, I want to bring you this in a little bit because I know you have a background in congressional affairs. Former U.S. President Donald Trump, and speaking of more close to the far-right populism side, has repeatedly threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO, and it's even gone so far as to say, and I'm quoting here, Putin can do whatever the hell they want against NATO members that don't meet the 2% defense spending minimum that we were chatting about earlier. How concerned should NATO members be about a second Trump presidency, and what steps can they take to prepare for one?
Sure. So I think it's in the realm of the possible. At my organization, at SIPA, we like to tell our European friends to focus on the here and now and who is in office that's currently President Biden. While it is always good, I am a lawyer by training, to have plan B, C, D, E, and F, I do believe that we have to focus on the present moment. And what is that? The U.S. is still in the alliance. We are still very much committed to our allies, to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So I hesitate when people get so spun up about a future Trump presidency, because I think we still have the rest of the year to do great things together, and we will cross that bridge when we get to it. I'm not going to speculate on the polls. We're still pretty far out from November here in the U.S., but I think that I like to rein people in a little bit about those concerns, because as we know, there are other great members that hopefully will take the lead. I have recently written on the Baltics have been truly wonderful, demonstrating their commitment to Ukraine, and hopefully will continue to take that leadership position in the alliance should the U.S. fall behind. But I think we're jumping the gun here a little bit when we start getting worried about Trump, because we need to focus on the here and now.
Sissy?
I think it's important to recognize that the possibility is there and it's real. But I agree with Krista on being careful and getting too spun up on ourselves. What have we seen since Russia invaded Ukraine the second time? We've seen an increase in defense spending. Whether or not that's happening in a coordinated and integrated way is a completely different question, and I won't get on that soapbox. But we are seeing real changes. We are seeing a real shift in the alliance. And that's something to cheer about. That is what we're going to be cheering about at the summit. We're going to hear about, I think right now it's at 18 out of the 32 members, probably will go up to 20 or 21 members meeting that 2% goal, which should be the seal or the floor. And in no means does meeting a in no way does meeting a number mean that Europe is secure. Not at all. But changes are being made, things are being done. I do think a little bit more can be done to make sure it's in a integrated way, to really make sure that deterrent effect is there, making sure that our capabilities are filling those gaps. But more can be done, but more is being done. And so I think that's something that we shouldn't lose sight on, because defense spending will continue to go up. We're still in peacetime, and when is the best time to build resilience? Well, it's now.
Luca, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think we tend to focus on the outcome of these elections, but I do think that it's important to again go back to, we have seen a really great and positive movement in Europe, and sort of the thought that Europe is willing to do more and is willing to invest in its own capabilities. And I think that's a trend that needs to continue. And I think that's more going to depend on the European elections and the outcomes of those, because we have a couple of big ones coming up as well on that front. even more so than here. And I think the Europeans themselves need to, and including, I'm putting myself in this basket as well, kind of come to terms with the fact that like this is something we need to do not because there's a potential of someone coming into the office in the US, but because it's our security, it's our stability, it's our peace at stake, and making sure that we can actually defend ourselves and provide some degree of a credible deterrent without having to go knock on Washington's doors. And I think that's an important factor. I think NATO is also, there's already important movements happening within NATO. The announcement of the potential $100 billion fund that Secretary General was mentioning a couple of days ago as a 5-year program of military aid to Ukraine is a great example of sort of these longer-term commitments that the alliance should serve as sort of as a breeding ground for, right? It should bring countries together and coordinate these efforts in order to make sure that we are not thinking about the next 4 years. Because I think when we were thinking about the previous holders of office in the U.S., it's always been like, well, how do we get through these 4 years, or how do we get through these challenges? But I think we need to start thinking strategically, and not to be the Scowcroft Strategy Center person in the room, but I think strategy matters, and I think at the end of the day, like long-term strategy is something that Europe has been lacking a lot, and is something that hopefully this specific war is going to sort of wake up Europe and bring it to this realization.
And you talked about European security, the threat to European security today. Late last month, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned NATO that F-16 fighter jets would be considered a legitimate military target, even on third country airfields, and that can include Baltic nations, Nordic nations. What's the risk of one country being a spoiler if NATO needs to respond to an Article 5 threat? I just want to throw that out to the four of you.
I can go.
Sure, take it.
Go for it.
I'm happy to. There's always a risk of that, right? But I think at the end of the day, this is why we're having these summits and why we're having ministerials and continuous and constant coordinations. I mean, I think there are so many countless meetings that NATO has every day that are specifically to try and get everyone on the same page that take place that indicates the still willingness of the alliance to be unified in response to potential threats and Article 5 response in particular. And frankly, so far we have seen very little indication that will change. Even those countries that have been, sort of a little bit harder to deal with when it comes to certain issues, and without naming anyone in particular, have expressed their strong support for the Article 5 and have showed very little sort of difference from or willingness to depart from that. They're still members of NATO. They're still active contributors to NATO. So I think as long as we remain focused on, maintaining that strong united front, and again, that's a challenge that I think is going to continue beyond Russia of today. I think, we need to think about what Russia is going to look like in the next 20, 30 years, how once hopefully the war in Ukraine is wrapped up and well behind us when we're talking about rebuilding Ukraine, right? Then we're going to have a very different Russia and a very different challenge at stake. And NATO is going to need to think about, well, what do we do with the Article 5 in those types of cases when we're talking about a much more hybrid and uncertain means of in which different actors are trying to interfere in our security.
Jason?
Yeah, we can't rule out the possibility that Putin will try something against a NATO ally. He's very paradoxical in his remarks. In one instance, he says that he would be foolish for attacking a NATO ally, given how many countries are in the alliance. But then on the next day, he's saying that he's not ruling out strikes on NATO bases that are training Ukrainian soldiers. I think it's worth looking ahead, as Lucas said, to the next couple of years. Right now, Putin is not in a position to open up another front with NATO allies. But who's to say where we'll be in 2 to 5 years once Russia's had a chance to reconstitute some of its military capabilities? Who's to say where Putin will be then in terms of his own internal power dynamics, and whether this will be something that he'll need to act on to remain a legitimate ruler of his country. So we don't know, but I think Article 5 being as ironclad as it is, this is where the former president's remarks are especially dangerous, calling into doubt the legitimacy of Article 5 and whether there would be a united response. That's a very dangerous thing to put out in the world.
Do you guys think that there could be an end to NATO in our lifetime? Our lifetime being obviously the next 75 years. Yeah. Sissy?
I think this is kind of where Krista's initial remarks on maintaining NATO's relevance really are key here. I think the messaging problem is not in Europe. Europe war is very close. All Europeans really see the threats that the Russians pose. Us here in America, the average Joe in Ohio, I don't know if that can be said. Does the average person in America really understand that the Russia threat is not just a threat to Europe, it is a global threat. It is a threat to global stability, democracy, and so much more. And so that messaging that is done here in the US around the summit, I mean, the summit is a perfect time for us to be ramping up our strategies here. But just tying in why the average person should care. And I mean, I do think that, and as a result of the Cold War and everything, that sentiment is still there, that people really still do see Russia as an adversary in ways. But I also don't want to close the door to Russian civil society. Not everybody agrees with Putin, and I think that's very important to remember here. So yeah, maintaining that relevance and kind of making the average person in America understand why we do this, why we spend so much on defense, that's key.
Luca?
I think, to slightly disagree with you, I don't think that the pertinence of war is equally felt, or sort of the support for the continued sacrifices, quote unquote, that Europe has made is felt equally across Europe. I think, Baltics are a great example of part of Europe that's felt Russian imperialism very much so. And so, of course, there's some degree of, and there's always going to be some degree of course, solidarity, regardless of how difficult it is. But I think, as the war drags on, it's also a question of, well, how do we maintain the momentum? And I think, in my opinion, at the end of the day, NATO has proven itself to be super adaptable to every single challenge that it has faced. Starting from, if we look at the 9/11 and the only time that the Article 5 was invoked and the unity that the alliance had then, to the French withdrawal from some of the NATO structures, that NATO has survived and now brought France even stronger and even more interested into NATO, which I think very few expected just a couple of years ago. And so I think that what NATO has and has demonstrated, and what makes me feel confident that there is a safe future for NATO, is that degree of adaptability and continued allied interest in making sure that the alliance survives and continues to thrive. And I think at the end of the day, it's not an easy task, but it does require, it requires a good Secretary General who is able to bring all the allies together. It requires, a good U.S. leadership and perspective, but also, and increasingly so, it's requiring a lot of European ownership of a lot of issues and challenges ahead. So I think it's a combination of answers here. But I also think when you ask this crowd in particular whether NATO is gonna survive, you're very rarely gonna get a no from a bunch of NATO nerds.
Jason, do you have a no? Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I just want to add to that, because I don't think we're in disagreement, actually. When I think about whether or not there's a splintering of NATO, I immediately think about a withdrawal of U.S. leadership, a withdrawal of the U.S. and NATO. I think maintaining that European solidarity as a whole will always be there, but whether or not the U.S. is a completely different problem. And I think that's the problem that we're facing here. And that's kind of where I went with the messaging part of it. Because at the end of the day, NATO is only as strong as all 32 allies together. And a big part of that is the US's role. There are a lot of critical capability gaps that Europeans have that are filled by the US. And when you think about a US withdrawal in NATO, well, of course, NATO will then be weakened if the US is not in it. So, yeah, I don't. Without a doubt.
But I do think NATO would survive even without the United States. It would be a shell of itself, but it would still continue in some capacity. I think it would continue to serve an important role in bringing together various countries in Europe to have these important debates about defense, deterrence. And if I could just also add, there's a generational component to this as well. We have to look to college students now in the United States and in Europe are seeing war in Ukraine, conflict in Israel. This is shaping their view of the world. And I think we need to continue to make the case for why NATO is relevant for the security of the 1 billion people that live in the 32 NATO allies, and also just for the wider world itself. None of the challenges that we face we can do alone. We need something like NATO. If we didn't have NATO, we would be forced to reinvent it 50 years from now. So.
You know, that's actually a good point to jump off. We only have a couple more minutes before we need to turn to audience questions. But I do want to ask, what is one step, and this is for each of you, one step that NATO members and its allies should take to address the next generation's concerns at Washington's NATO summit in July? How do we pull in the next generation into the conversation of today? Krista, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think it gets back to my first comment about relevance and speaking to next generation folks, here in the United States and across the alliance. As we've also mentioned already today, there is, our generation grew up in very peaceful times for the most part. In the last 2 years, yes, we have seen the war in Ukraine and obviously now Hamas and Israel. But as a result, there is a whole lot, gap, a generation that has forgotten what it is like. As a Latvian, as an immigrant, I know that story. My grandparents fled and give me the motivation to get up every day and work on these great things related to transatlantic defense and security issues. But I don't blame that whole generation that doesn't know what that's like. They don't feel the sense of urgency. They don't know why we need to spend so much on defense because they, for the most part, have lived through peaceful times. And unfortunately, the war in Ukraine and conflicts around the world just seem so far away. They're oceans away. So we don't feel that tangible pull on us each day. So again, I have to say that I'm always concerned about how we can educate this next generation of leaders about why it matters and why we should invest in our militaries and encourage people to go into the armed services, armed forces. Numbers are down in the United States, and how do we reinvigorate people to be interested in these issues? Because as we've all said, we are a group of NATO nerds here on stage today, but there's a whole generation of people that are not. And so how can we invigorate them?
Luca?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, but I think we have a curious mix of people here on the stage. I think in part for me, like I grew up in Croatia, so I know, and I was the post-war baby who hears the stories about the role that NATO played in the Balkans, and for me, it's a very much sort of something that was close to home, and I can see the NATO's I know how things were before we had peace and stability, right? And I think once you have that much closer to home, then it is easier to understand why NATO is important. I think one thing that the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council has been doing is this campaign NATO in America, which essentially is going outside the Beltway and talking to students across this country in order to really emphasize, well, why are we even backing this alliance? At the end of the day, yes, a lot of you don't remember a world before peace and stability, a world before America could have been threatened or our allies could have been attacked at any moment. But we are increasingly moving in a very complex world that might be a likelihood. And we need to be ready, and we need to have the ability and the mechanism to cooperate and to work together. And I think we have a really good one on our hands in NATO. And so I think to some extent, it really is sort of, I always say encouraging people to, and NATO has done this really good historically with, Churchill did speeches, for example, across the Midwest, and a lot of European leaders are doing this today. And I think it's important to continue that and to continue to engage with not just across the US and outside of sort of the East and the West Coast, but also go into the European quote unquote countryside, talk to the people and make sure that the importance of NATO in ensuring peace and stability is felt, because I think that's something that's been sort of generationally now taken for granted.
Sissy?
To add to the brilliant points that my colleagues are making, I think that NATO should be prepared to answer the question to the next generation of like, how are you keeping us safe? Like, explain, no one really understands regional plans unless you're in the NATO nerd community. But like that relevance is so important, and just thinking about kind of how to keep up with that relevance and making people understand that this is why we do the things that we do. Because you're right, our generation has grown up in peacetime, and none of us really know what it is like to be afraid to go to bed at night because there might be a bomb dropped on us, you know? So keeping that will be important, but I do think NATO is taking efforts to do that. I've heard talks that several U.S. mayors from around the country will be at the NATO summit. I think that's an incredible step because you need more people out there that are outside of the Beltway at the summit, understanding what's happening. I know that the NATO Youth Summit will take place, I heard, in Florida. That's an important step, just keeping that engagement up. And I think we're doing what we can, but the messaging component is what will be crucial here.
Fully agreed on the messaging component. That's really critical. All eyes are going to be on Washington this July, and how the alliance comes together is really going to play out, and especially when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, the future of Ukraine is the future of Europe. It is the future of NATO. Whether the alliance can really kind of transition Ukraine into the full structure, that's going to determine so much about how I think the next generation and people all around the world see the NATO alliance.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I want to turn it to the audience now. For in-person participants, if you've got a question, please come up to the mic. Otherwise, I'm going to take, I know there's a couple questions online as well. All right, I'll start with one of these. I'm going to bring it up so my poor eyesight can see it. Okay. Outside of the general defense and deterrence realm, the future will bring emerging challenges in the hybrid and space domains, as well as with the effects of climate change. How can the Alliance meet these coming challenges in the future without sacrificing defense and deterrence strategies now? Sissy, do you want to take a stab at this?
Sure. Sure, why not? This goes back to my point about how there's just so much on NATO's plate. There's so many things that need to be covered. The war in Ukraine, everybody initially thought that hybrid warfare was going to be the main type of warfare used. No, it wasn't. It went all back to conventional. So now we're seeing that refocus back. Never lose sight of the importance of conventional warfare. And so there's that component, but I also think NATO is tackling these problems. We have NATO ACT down in Norfolk, Virginia, Allied Command Transformation, that kind of looks at these problems. I do think our cyber and our hybrid space, all these things, these are real challenges, but I do think that we are living up to taking the problem seriously and finding solutions and making sure that we're evolving in a way that does not inhibit innovation.
And Krista, you have a background in cybersecurity as well, if I'm remembering right.
Huh. You're generous. I would be happy to speak on this, though. So putting on my lawyer hat, so this is something I researched in law school and relates to obviously conversations we're having today. And on these like low threshold cyber attacks, I traditionally call them cyber operations. But again, it's challenging because they don't rise to the level of armed conflict under international law. You know, there are certain things that have to be met, and you know, it's kind of the "I'm not touching you" game, you know, that Russia likes to play. You know, we obviously have seen that the most major one was in Estonia in the early 2000s, but the Baltics experience unfortunately cyber attacks quite regularly, and they've become experts. When you ask, they're not really worried about these issues anymore. But again, these issues continue to persist, and the Russian bots continue to multiply and continue to find new ways, you know, to perpetrate into our societies. And it relates to these bigger issues of disinformation. And you know, as we have mentioned, many elections coming up around the world this year. You know, we have to be vigilant in making sure, you know, the information and news that we are consuming, you know, is legitimate, that it is accurate. I think, unfortunately, it's almost weekly now. You see news outlets having to, you know, take back and say, "Oh my gosh, so sorry, we actually were duped by this ourselves." So I think, again, we have to be concerned about that, and this is a challenge that's not going away for NATO. What you do about it, I think that the centers of excellence have been great examples of this, being able to focus on issues of cyber. But we're all living in a more interconnected online world, so this issue is not going away.
And Luca, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the causes of war are not going to change. I think we're always going to have economic disparity. We're always going to have sort of great power competition, ideological differences. Those are always going to be the drivers, right? But when it comes to the means of waging war, that will drastically change and is already changing, right? As we can see even in Ukraine, right? From hybrid warfare or use of particular sort of emerging tech tools and specifically, and that requires new concepts and new types of preparation from our end. But I think in particular what's going to be important here is not necessarily for NATO just to sort of be the breeding ground for the academic thinking behind it, or sort of to be the place. Diana is a great initiative, and there are so many other centers of excellence that NATO has supported and started as well. But I think it's the mastery of specific technologies and the ability to use them is what NATO is going to have to be able to do. So when we talk about deep tech, when we are talking about AI, it's not just the fact that we need to be sure to be able to know how to respond in order to prevent further escalation, but we also need to be able to secure ourselves, because as of now, it doesn't look like we have the full capability to secure ourselves from cyber threats and emerging threats, and that's something that we're still working on. And similarly, when we had in February the announcement from the House Intelligence Committee on the space capabilities by Russia that with a nuclear character, that's something that caught a lot of people by surprise, and reasonably so, right? And I think that's something, space is going to be a domain where we need to eventually, and we need to start thinking about it now, like what are the ways in which we can be the ones on the cutting edge of it instead of our enemies.
We had a question over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Kaluba. I have the honor of leading the transatlantic security work here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm Luca's boss, and I know all your bosses. But I want to lean into this next-gen perspective, right? You are the next generation of policymakers. My team gets to hear me pontificate all day long about things about NATO, and Krista, you with Katie, and Sissy, you with Max. When you hear established NATO nerds, or old NATO nerds maybe, talk about the alliance, talk about policy issues around the alliance, what are we missing? How, when you hear me talking, Luca, when do you want to jump in and yell, but Chris, like this is just old think, you're getting it wrong? I'd like to ask each of you, what are the things that the established NATO policy community is missing in the debate? Thank you.
Jason, you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. That's a tough question, though, so I don't want to get into too much trouble with my boss, who may or may not be watching. But I would say I think that one of the things that our generation adds to the debate is we come at this from a post-Cold War era. A lot of our thinking is not at where Europe was, for that long stretch from the end of the Second World War to the end of the Cold War. So I think that we tend to view Europe as a little bit more malleable, a little bit more in flux. And I think that some of that thinking translates to the NATO level, where we're open to new frameworks of nations. You have the Joint Expeditionary Force that's led by the UK. I think that's a really interesting look at how coalitions of the willing can emerge within NATO, and how that kind of activity can be encouraged to respond to all kinds of different threats. So that's my quick.
I love this question, actually, and my boss will be very happy if he's actually watching this. But my answer is the more NATO-EU cooperation. And Jason mentioned this in Secretary Blinken's speech recently, and then Luca mentioned Madeleine Albright's 3D speech. The 3Ds approach was the status quo for a very long time, and I think recently there have been some shifts. The shifts have been happening at the European level for a little bit longer, but I think we're really seeing the shifts in American rhetoric. I've heard from senior U.S. defense officials that they are supportive of a European defense industrial base, that is in our interest, that it should not just be buy American. We should be encouraging Europeans to do more, and that is a perfectly tangible way for them to do more. So seeing the getting away from the status quo, thinking that NATO is NATO and NATO cannot have any of the EU's help, that change will be incredibly special. I really hope it does take shape more throughout this next generation, but it's definitely something that's been missing and a long time coming.
I agree with everything said, but I think for me, one particular aspect of this discussion, and when it comes to next gen leaders, is what we kind of touched upon a little bit, which is a reminder to the generations that came before us about the fact that we take peace and security and stability for granted. And in order to make sure that NATO remains relevant, that NATO remains strong, requires engaging with a whole new generation of people in a drastically different ways, which means that NATO is going to need to be more political, that it's going to need to be more present on the ground, and that it's going to need to be visible in ways that it hasn't been visible so far, which means, transparency. And I think that those are the three requirements in my head when I often, listen to these discussions and debates, where I just think to myself, yes, that's great. And I think most of the people who have seen a lot of the US and the European foreign policy over the last couple of decades, I think all of us agree on a lot of these things, right? But when it comes to specifically ensuring that, our generation and our peers remain interested in this area and supportive, I think it's going to require a little bit more effort and strategic thinking about, population engagement and specifically next generation engagement.
I would just have to say, we have to encourage and lift up other young leaders. I think we all know that all boats rise. We all benefit when we think of new creative ideas, when we involve more diverse audiences and people. I am the sole lawyer at my think tank. Let's bring more people like me that think through things a little bit differently and look at sanctions. And I'm super excited about language like that. May and must, there's a difference between those words and what they legally mean. I will go on and on. But again, I think that you have to encourage other young people. And I think it's wonderful that we have this panel today of next gen leaders. But we also have to make sure we're encouraging folks around the world within NATO. Does that, as I mentioned, encouraging people to go into the armed forces, encouraging people to go study these issues. But we have to keep diversifying and involving different folks and not just us policy wonks that are focused on these topics, because I think we will come up with some more creative solutions to the problems of today.
And just to quickly jump in on what you were saying, I think really when it comes to, think about things that are important to us and that drive us to, to military service, and it's not the hard security issues always. It's more of the challenges that our generation is going to be facing, which is the climate change, which is the emerging tech. Those are the things that drive us at the end of the day. And most of the time when you see an article written about NATO and climate change, it's someone who's usually our age, who is trying to get it into people's heads. But it is something that I think is going to drive a lot of people to join armed forces and to reinvigorate some of that drive that existed maybe during the Cold War or at the end of the Cold War.
We had another question over here.
Yeah, thanks. Ryan Eric with the Council. My point is actually going to pick up on exactly what Luca just shared, and thank you to the four of you and to Alexandra for moderating today. We're celebrating NATO at 75 today, 75 years of an alliance, but we're also looking at 75 years in the future. And I think one of the things in terms of NATO's relevance down the road is the effects of climate change. I mean, climate change will affect the future of warfighting. It already is, in the high north especially. We've talked about Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. But NATO last year established the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Canada. And I'm curious if you all have any thoughts about what NATO's role is in addressing kind of the effects of climate change. What's NATO's role in integrating a climate lens into its warfighting abilities? I'm curious if you have any ideas that NATO maybe can take forward. Thanks.
Jason?
Just very briefly, as I don't work on this in particular and am not as in the weeds on it, but I think the Secretary General just highlighting that climate change does have an impact on NATO is in and of itself a really great step. He's a very public figure and he's drawing attention to this important issue. Establishing the Center of Excellence, as you pointed out, is another great step in terms of just bringing together all of the best possible people to work on that. That's just my quick take.
Sissy?
I'm going to pull on my EU thread because I also want to highlight that the EU has an enormous economic toolkit that NATO does not possess. And I think this is where the utility of the EU could really come to fruition here. It could help NATO in discovering new ways to reduce climate change dependencies done by NATO. It just adds a new lens as to how we're thinking about our war fighting. How are we spending our money, in what equipment, et cetera. I think that there's a role for other partnerships to play here, not just in NATO, but outside of NATO.
I agree with everything, and I would just say, I think private sector as well has a really important role here to kind of sell the importance of integrating climate security as kind of the core of NATO's thinking. And I think private sector oftentimes also feels especially when it comes to industry, right? They feel the effects on their own production abilities to ship things, abilities to produce things, get the resources they need in so many different ways. And we haven't really touched upon the role of the private sector in NATO as well. But I think for me, besides everything that's been said, it's something that has a really important role in sort of bringing it to, I think, each allied nation's attention, more so than the NATO itself. I think NATO is doing a good job, but I think the allied nations are the ones who need to step up.
I think we're going to see a war in our lifetime on fighting over water. I genuinely believe that. I think that means that we need to look to the places where this is already occurring, and NATO might need to, beef up their climate folks in Brussels and make sure that we are plugged into these issues, because water is life. And like I said, I really do unfortunately think within our lifetimes we will see conflicts over water. And as a result, NATO can start preparing now, and look. We know where those areas are, where there is and isn't water. So that is my concern.
I also just want to second that CSIS is actually, not to plug, but CSIS is undertaking a massive project that looks at this through our New Frontiers lens, and we have found that water is one of the most scarce things in our lifetime, and that we will see some real drastic changes because of it. And so I think the role for NATO here is to prove that we can evolve and that we can adapt and that we can think of new ways to tackle these problems outside of the status quo thinking.
I wanted to end, we only have time for like one more question, so I want to end on a positive note. If you four were to go up and meet NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, what would you want to say to them?
I'll start.
Yeah.
First of all, I did get to meet him at the 2022 NATO Youth Summit in Brussels that CEPA got to co-host with NATO PDD. I just want to say thank you. He has extended his tenure multiple times, and I think we all, I just want to give him a big hug and thank him for that. I think we are all, better, stronger together thanks to his leadership. I'm sure he did not know what he was stepping into, and just truly as a Latvian and American, truly grateful for everything that he's done. There have been, I'm sure, some really tough nights for him, or months or years, but just a big thank you.
I think maybe just kind of one sentence is, make sure to reinforce that whoever comes after you, that they remain as determined to ensure allied unity, and also being a mediator between allies when it's needed, because I think that's what the current Secretary General has done in a unique and really effective way. And of course, wishing him a good and well-deserved retirement.
Adding to that, of course, I would obviously tell him thank you for your service, but I would also highlight that it's not just him. It takes a village, and everybody at SHAPE, at NATO HQ, at the different Joint Force Commands throughout Europe and the U.S. It takes all of us. It's not just one person leading the pack. Well, on the face of it, yes, it is. It takes a group effort, and it's definitely worth applauding how far we've come.
Yeah, just to echo my colleagues' comments, I would thank Secretary General Stoltenberg. I had a Norwegian colleague say, why is NATO holding this man hostage? He just wants to go back to the Norwegian forests and be happy and free. And so I would hope that Secretary General would take a long vacation afterwards. But just to drive home some of the points that my colleagues have made, looking ahead to the next Secretary General, he or she will have a tremendous amount of pressure and a tremendous amount of work ahead of them to keep the alliance unified. I think that was a theme that we all kind of picked up on, was that alliance unity is key moving forward. So I would say to whoever takes on this job next, good luck to them. So.
Well, that looks like all the time we have for today. Thank you again, our 4 panelists, for making the time to be here and for sharing your valuable insights on NATO. I want to thank everyone who asked questions, and especially the Atlantic Council for hosting, especially as the world gears up for Washington's NATO summit in July. Thank you for being here.